The engineers were working with us, preparing to dynamite the ammunition we had heaped against the huts, over the carcasses of 8 dismantled trucks. Toward noon, we organised a fireworks display that any municipality might have envied. Carts, sleighs and buildings were all dynamited and burned. 2 heavy howitzers, which the tractors hadn't been able to pull from the mire, were loaded with shells of any calibre. Then we poured any explosive that came to hand into their tubes and shut the breach as best we could. The howitzers were split in 2 by the explosions, scattering showers of lethal shrapnel. We felt exhilarated, filled with the spirit of destructive delight. In the evening, the Spandaus stopped a few Soviet patrols, who had undoubtedly come to see what was happening. During our last hour, we were under light artillery fire, which caused us a certain emotion. Then we left. After the period of light artillery fire, the troops covering the Panzergruppe signalled several enemy penetrations into our former positions. A hasty departure order was given. We were no longer organised to hold off the Russians for any length of time. I was carrying my belongings, looking for a vehicle, when our Feldwebel assigned me to a truck we had captured from the enemy and was now carrying our wounded. "Step on the gas," he shouted. "We're getting out!" Every soldier in the Wehrmacht was supposed to know how to drive. I had been given some idea of how to handle military vehicles during my training in Poland, but on machines of a very different kind. However, as one never discussed orders, I jumped into the driver's seat of the Tatra. In front of me, the dashboard presented an array of dials whose needles uniformly pointed down, a few buttons, and a series of words in indecipherable characters. The engineers had just attached the heavy truck to the back of a Mark IV. We would be leaving instantly. It was essential that I get the wretched machine to start. I considered climbing out and confessing my incapacity, but repressed the idea, fearing they might assign me to something more difficult or even leave me behind to fend for myself. If I couldn't move, I would be captured by the Bolsheviks, a thought which terrified me. I pawed frantically at the dashboard and was blessed by a miracle. My desperate eye fell on Ernst, who was clearly looking for a lift. I felt saved. "Ernst!" I shouted. "Over here! I've got room!" My friend joyfully jumped aboard. "I was ready to hang on to the back of a tank," he said. "Thanks for the seat." "Ernst," I asked in a voice of supplication, "do you know how these damned things work?" "You're a fine fellow, sitting here when you don't know the first thing about it," he replied. I had no time to explain. The powerful engine of the tank to which we were attached was already roaring. Hurriedly, we pulled at the controls. From the turret, one of the tank men signalled to me to put the truck in gear at the same time as the tank, to reduce the jolt for the wounded. Neubach pulled a lever under the dashboard, and we felt a responding throb from under the hood. I pressed down hard on the accelerator, and the engine made a series of loud bangs. "Gently!" the Feldwebel shouted at me. I smiled, nodded, and let up on the pedal. The chain stretched taut, and we increased our speed. How fast were we going? I had no idea. I knew with certainty only that we were not in reverse. The heavy truck took off with a brusque jolt, producing a chorus of groans and curses behind me. Later on, in France, a pretentious officer undertook to instruct me on a wretched Renault 4CV, with all the airs of a commander of an ocean liner. I had to sit through a course of ludicrous demonstrations to receive a scrap of pink paper declaring me competent to drive an automobile. I didn't waste any time explaining that I had driven through Russia on a track which was more like a river than a road, fastened to a huge tank whose jolts were a constant threat to the front of my machine, which I felt certain would be wrenched off. He would never have believed me. By that time I belonged to the victorious Allies, who were all heroes, like every French soldier I met after the war. Only victors have stories to tell. We, the vanquished, were all cowards and weaklings by then, whose memories, fears, and enthusiasms should not be remembered. The first night of retreat was complicated by a fine rain, which required of Ernst and me the agility and balance of acrobats simply to keep our Tatra in the wake of the Mark IV. Without the tank, we would never have been able to escape from that swamp. The driver stepped on the accelerator in fits of irritation, dragging the Tatra, which threatened to disintegrate. The tank treads churned the ground into a heavy syrup, which the rain thinned into soup. The windshield became completely caked with mud, and Ernst waded through the liquid ground to scrape it away with his hands. The blacked-out headlight had been left with only a narrow strip uncovered. Within a few minutes, this strip was sealed by mud, so that we had no light at all. I couldn't even see the back of the tank, although it was no more than 5 yards ahead of us. Our truck, more often than not at an oblique angle to the tank, was constantly being pulled back into line by the tightly stretched chain. Each time this happened, I wondered if we still had our front wheels. Behind us, the wounded had stopped moaning. Maybe they were all dead. What difference did it make? The convoy moved ahead, and daylight dawned on faces haggard with exhaustion. During the night, the convoy had spread out. It no longer seemed to matter whether we were ahead of schedule or behind. The driver of our Panzer suddenly turned off to the right, leaving the track, which had become impassable even for a tank, and drove straight up the scrub-covered bank, crushing the sodden birches under his treads. Our truck, whose wheels by this time were balls of mud, was pulled forward, while its engine rattled helplessly. Then everything came to a complete halt. This was the second stop since our departure. We had stopped once in the night to gas up. The poor bastards on the back of the tank jumped down among the broken branches. Their backsides had been burning all night on the hot metal over the engine, while the rest of their bodies froze in the cold rain. An exchange of shouted abuse, which was nearly a fight, broke out at once between a non-com in the engineers and the Panzerführer. Everyone else took advantage of this opportunity to crap and eat. "1 hour's rest!" shouted the non-com, who had taken on the leadership of the group. "Make the most of it!" "Fuck you!" shouted the Panzerführer, who had no intention of being pushed around by some half-baked engineer. "We'll leave when I've had enough sleep." "We have to get to Belgorod this morning," the non-com said in a steely voice. He undoubtedly nourished dreams of being an officer. Then, putting his hand on the Mauser, which hung at his side, he added, "We'll leave when I give the order. I've got the highest rank here, and you'll obey me." "Shoot me if you like, and drive the tank yourself. I haven't slept in 2 days, and you're going to leave me the hell alone," retorted the Panzerführer. The other flushed crimson but said nothing. Then he turned to us. "You two, instead of standing there asleep on your feet, get into the truck and help the wounded. They have their needs too." "That's it," added the tank driver, who was clearly looking for trouble. "And when they're finished, the Herr Sergeant will wipe their asses." "You watch it or I'll report you," snorted the sergeant, now white with rage. Inside the truck, the wounded had not died, despite the jolting of the journey. They were no longer making any noise, and we could see that some of their bandages were soaked with fresh blood. Fighting the exhaustion which made our hearts race, we helped them down and back as best we could, omitting only one man who was missing both legs. They all asked us for something to drink, and in our ignorance we gave them as much water or brandy as they wanted. We certainly shouldn't have done this. 2 men died a short time later. We buried them in the mud, with sticks and their helmets to mark their graves. Then Ernst and I curled up in the cab, trying to snatch a little sleep. But sleep wouldn't come, and we lay instead, with throbbing temples, talking of peace. 2 hours later, it was the tank driver who gave the order to depart, as he had predicted. It was now mid-morning. The day was clear and bright, and large chunks of snow fell slowly from the trees. "Ha!" he said. "Our general left us all while we were asleep. Maybe he felt like taking a walk." It seemed that the non-com really was gone. He must have managed a ride in one of the trucks that had passed us during our rest. "That shit has gone to make his report," shouted the tank driver. "If I catch up with him, I'll drive right over him, flatten him out like a goddamn Bolshevik." It took us a while to extricate ourselves from the bank we had driven into. However, 2 hours later, we arrived at a hamlet whose name I no longer remember, some 5 miles from Belgorod. It was filled with soldiers from every branch of the army. The few streets were perfectly straight and lined with low houses. The way the roofs sat on the walls reminded me of heads with no foreheads, whose hair grows right into the eyebrows. There were swarms of soldiers and a multitude of rolling equipment covered with mud, pushing through the shouting mob of soldiers, most of whom were looking for their regiments. The road at this point had been roughly resurfaced and was much more negotiable. We unhooked ourselves from the tank and took on 8 or 10 of the engineers who had been riding on its back. Somewhat bewildered by this flood of soldiers, I had stopped the truck and was looking for my company. 2 MPs told me they thought it had gone on toward Kharkov, but as they weren't sure, they sent me to the redirection centre, which had been organised in a trailer and was staffed by 3 officers who were tearing their hair. When I was finally able to catch their attention through the thousands of shouts and gesticulations besieging them, I was harshly reprimanded for straggling. They probably would have sent me to be court-martialed if they'd had time. The disorder was incredible, and the Lancer, half furious, half joking, flooded into the Russian huts. We might as well sleep while we wait for all this to settle down. All they wanted was a dry corner where they could lie down, but there were so many men crammed into each isba that there was almost no room left for the Russians who lived in them. Not knowing what to do with myself, I went to find Ernst, who had gone to look for information. However, he had run into a truck hospital and had returned to the Tatra with an orderly who was checking over our wounded. "They can go on as they are," the orderly said. "What?" Ernst asked. "But we've already buried 2 of them. At least we should give them fresh dressings." "Don't be stubborn and stupid. If I label them urgent, they'll have to wait their turn, lying in the street. You'll get to Belgorod quicker than that, and escape the trap that's closing on us." "Is the situation serious?" Ernst asked. "Yes." So Ernst and I found ourselves responsible for 20 wounded men, some of them in critical condition, who had already been waiting several days for essential medical attention. We didn't know what to say when a man grimacing with pain asked us if he would soon be at the hospital. "Let's get going," Ernst said, frowning anxiously. "Maybe he's right. If I'd ever thought it would be like this." I had been at the wheel for only a few minutes when Ernst tapped me on the shoulder. "Come on, little one, stop. You'll finish somebody off if it goes on like this. Hand over." "But I'm supposed to drive, Ernst. I'm the one who's in the driver's corps." "Never mind, let me do it. You'll never get us out of here." It was true. Despite my best efforts, the truck was jolting and sliding from one side of the road to the other. We arrived at the village exit point, where there was an interminable line of vehicles waiting for gas. Thousands of soldiers were walking up and down on either side of the road. An MP ran over to us. "Why aren't you waiting like everybody else?" "We've got to leave right away, Herr Gendarme. We're carrying wounded, and that's what the infirmary told us." "Wounded? Serious cases?" He spoke in the doubting, disbelieving tone of every policeman in the world. "Of course," said Ernst, who certainly wasn't exaggerating. The policeman had to peer under the canvas anyway. "They don't look so bad to me." There was a furious outburst of swearing. From time to time, wounded men availed themselves of their special position to abuse the police. "You son of a bitch!" groaned one man, who was missing a piece of his shoulder. "It's shits like you who should be sent to the front. Let us through, or I'll strangle you with the one good hand I have left." The feverish Lancer was sitting up in spite of his pain, which made him frighteningly white. He seemed quite capable of putting this threat into action. The policeman flushed, and his nerve faltered at the sight of these 20 battered wrecks. The position of a big city policeman roaring at some pathetic bourgeois for going through a red light is a far cry from that of an MP behind the lines dealing with a gang of combat veterans who are holding their guts in with their hands, or have just bayoneted the guts out of somebody else. His display of bad temper turned into a set little smile. "Get out of here," he said, with the air of someone who doesn't give a damn. When the wheels of the truck began to turn, he vented the last of his spleen. "Go and die somewhere else." It was hard to get even 8 gallons of gas, and when we managed it, our tank swallowed them in an instant. But we were glad to take what we could and get out. A feeble attempt had been made at surfacing the road, but there were still long stretches of bare ground which had become deep quagmires to be avoided at all costs. We proceeded on the highway or beside it as circumstances required. Far to the right, we could see another convoy struggling forward in a line parallel to ours. The men were dressed for battle and seemed to be prepared for an encounter with the Soviets. We were stopped by a new set of police who combed our papers to see if they could find any mistakes. They checked the truck, verified our ID cards and our destination, but when it came to the destination, they had to give us directions. One of them looked through the directory hanging around his neck and told us, in a voice like a barking dog's, that we had to turn off the road 100 yards ahead and proceed to Kharkov. We followed these instructions with regret because the new road rapidly deteriorated into a ribbon of mire. At our speed, we would soon have exhausted our supply of gas. We kept passing vehicles abandoned in the mud because of mechanical failure or because they had run out of gas. A short distance along the new road, we were stopped by a group of about 50 Lancer on foot in a state of unbelievable filth. They took our truck by storm. There were several wounded men among them. Some of them had ripped off their filthy dressings and were walking with their wounds open to the air. "Make room for us, fellows," they said, hanging on as hard as they could. "You can see that we haven't got any room," Ernst answered. "Let go." But we couldn't get rid of them. They swarmed over the tailgate, trampling on our wounded to try to make them move over. Ernst and I shouted at them, but it didn't do any good. They piled on everywhere. "Take me!" whimpered a poor devil scratching at my door with bloody hands. Another waved a pass which was already almost expired. The arrival of a Steiner, followed by 2 trucks, restored order. An SS captain climbed out of the Steiner. "What's this ant heap? No wonder you've broken down. It's impossible. There must be at least 100 men here." The men scattered immediately, without asking for anything more. Ernst saluted and explained the situation. "Very good," said the captain. "You take 5 more along with your wounded. We'll take another 5, and the rest will have to walk until the convoy comes by. Let's get going." Ernst explained that we would be out of gas in a few minutes. The captain signalled to some soldiers on the Steiner, who gave us 6 gallons. A few minutes later, we were on our way again. We kept passing groups of men wading through the mud who begged us to pick them up, but we didn't stop. Toward noon, with our last drop of gas, we reached a town where a unit was being assembled for the front. I escaped becoming an infantryman before my time by a hair's breadth. We had to wait until the following day before we could use the reserve of 5 gallons of gas which Ernst was able to draw. We were about to leave when an unexpected and unpleasant sound struck our ears. In the distance, still quite far away, we heard the booming of big guns. As we thought we were by now far from the front, we were both astonished and alarmed. We didn't know, and I didn't know until much later, that our course had been taking us parallel to the Belgorod-Kharkov line. Nonetheless, after unloading 2 dying men to make room for 3 more wounded, we set off without delay. In the middle of that afternoon, everything went wrong again. Our truck was more or less in the middle of a column of 10. We had just passed an armoured unit whose tanks looked like a giant version of the slimy creatures that emerge on mudflats at low tide. They must have been on their way to meet the enemy, who seemed to be very close. We could hear artillery on our left, despite the loud labouring noises of the trucks. Ernst and I exchanged anxious looks. We were stopped by some soldiers who were setting up an anti-tank gun. "Dig in, fellows!" shouted an officer as we slowed down. "Ivan's getting pretty close." This time, at least, they were telling us something. But I wondered how the Russians, who had been left some 90 miles behind, could already be in this district. Ernst, who was driving, stepped on the gas. 2 other trucks did the same. Suddenly 5 planes appeared in the sky at a moderate altitude. I pointed them out to Ernst. "They're Yaks!" he shouted. "Take cover!" We were surrounded by bare mud, with occasional clumps of stunted brush. There was a sound of machine gun fire from the sky. The column drove more quickly, toward a shallow fold in the ground which might give some protection. I was leaning out the window, trying to see through the flying mud spun by our wheels. 2 Focke-Wulfs had appeared and shot down 2 of the Yaks, which crashed far to the west. Until the final stages of the war, Russian aircraft were no match for the Luftwaffe. Even in Prussia, where Russian air power was its most active, the appearance of one Messerschmitt 109 or one Focke-Wulf would make a dozen armoured Ilyushin bombers turn and run. At this period, when German air power still possessed important reserves, the lot of the Russian pilots was not enviable. 2 of the 3 remaining Yaks had taken flight, pursued by our planes, when the last dived straight at the convoy. One of the Focke-Wulfs was chasing him and was plainly trying to get him, in his sights. We reached the dip in the road. The Soviet plane had come down very low to use its machine guns. The trucks ahead of us had stopped short, and the able-bodied were jumping down into the mud. I was already holding the door open, and I jumped, with my feet together, plunging face downward, when I heard the machine guns. With my nose in the mud, my hands on my head, and my eyes instinctively shut, I heard the machine gun and the 2 planes through a hellish intensity of noise. The sound of racing engines was followed by a loud explosion. I looked up to watch the plane with the black crosses on its wings regain altitude. 300 or 400 yards away, where the Yak had crashed, there was a plume of black smoke. Everybody was getting up again. "One more who won't give any trouble," shouted a fat corporal, who was clearly delighted to be still alive. Several voices joined in a cheer for the Luftwaffe. "Anybody hit?" one of the non-coms called out. "Let's get going then." I walked over to the Tatra, trying to brush off the worst of the mud that clung to my uniform. I noticed 2 holes in the door I had opened to get out, which appeared to have swung shut on its own momentum. 2 round holes, each outlined by a ring of metal from which the paint had been scraped away. Nervously, I pulled open the door. Inside I saw a man I shall never forget, a man sitting normally on the seat, whose lower face had been reduced to a bloody pulp. "Ernst?" I asked in a choking voice. "Ernst!" I threw myself at him. "Ernst! What? Say something! Ernst!" I looked frantically for some features on that horrible face. "Ernst!" I was nearly crying. Outside, the column was getting ready to leave. The 2 trucks behind me were impatiently blowing their horns. "Hey!" I ran toward the first of the trucks. "Stop! Come with me! I've got a wounded man!" I was frantic. The doors of the truck behind me swung open and 2 soldiers stuck out their heads. "Well, young fellow, are you going to move or aren't you?" "Stop!" I shouted louder than ever. "I've got a wounded man." "We have 30, one of the soldiers shouted back. "Get going. The hospital isn't too far from here." Their voices rose over mine, and the noise of their trucks, which had pulled out and were passing me, drowned my cries of desperation. Now I was alone, with a Russian truck loaded with wounded men, and Ernst Neubach, who was dead or dying. "You shits! Wait for me! Don't go without us!" I burst into tears and gave way to a mad impulse. I grabbed my Mauser, which I'd left in the truck. My eyes were swimming and I could barely see. I felt for the trigger, and pointing the gun at the sky, fired all 5 cartridges in the magazine, hoping that to someone in the trucks this would sound like a cry for help. But no one stopped. The trucks continued to roll away from me, sending out a spray of mud on each side. In despair, I returned to the cabin and ripped open my kit to look for a package of dressings. "Ernst," I said, "I'm going to bandage you. Don't cry." I was insane. Ernst wasn't crying. I was. His coat was covered with blood. With the dressings in my hand, I stared at my friend. He must have been hit in the lower jaw. His teeth were mixed with fragments of bone, and through the gore I could see the muscles of his face contracting, moving what was left of his features. In a state of near shock, I tried to put the dressing somewhere on that cavernous wound. When this proved impossible, I pushed a needle into the tube of morphine and jabbed ineffectually through the thicknesses of cloth. Crying like a small boy, I pushed my friend to the other end of the seat, holding him in my arms and soaking in his blood. 2 eyes opened, brilliant with anguish, and looked at me from his ruined face. "Ernst!" I laughed through my tears. "Ernst!" He slowly lifted his hand and put it on my forearm. Half choked with emotion, I started the truck and managed to begin moving without too great a jolt. For a quarter of an hour, I drove through a web of ruts with one eye on my friend. His grip on my arm tightened and eased in proportion to his pain, and his death rattle rose and fell, sometimes louder than the noise of the truck. Choking back my tears, I prayed without reason or thought, saying anything that came into my head. Save him. Save Ernst, God. He believed in you. Save him. Show yourself. But God did not answer my appeals. In the cab of a grey Russian truck, somewhere in the vastness of the Russian hinterland, a man and an adolescent were caught in a desperate struggle. The man struggled with death, and the adolescent struggled with despair, which is close to death. And God, who watches everything, did nothing. The breath of the dying man passed with difficulty through that horrible wound, making huge bubbles of blood and saliva. I considered every possibility. I could turn back and look for help, or force the men I was carrying to tend to Ernst, at gunpoint if necessary, or even kill Ernst to cut short his sufferings. But I knew very well I couldn't kill him. I had not yet been obliged to fire directly at anyone. My tears had dried, leaving the trace of their passage on my filthy face, betraying my weakness to the world. I was no longer crying, and my feverish eyes stared at the knob on the radiator 2 meters in front of me, which cut hypnotically into the interminable horizon. For long moments, Ernst's hand would tighten on my arm, and each time I was overwhelmed by fresh panic. I couldn't look at that horrifying face. Several German planes passed overhead, through the cloudy sky, and in a desperate attempt at telepathy, every fibre in my body appealed to them for help. But maybe they were Russian planes. It didn't matter. I had no time to spare. No time to spare. The expression assumed its full significance, as so many expressions do in wartime. Ernst's hand gripped my arm convulsively. The pressure continued for so long that I slid my foot off the accelerator and stopped, afraid of the worst. I turned and looked at the mutilated face, whose eyes seemed to be fixed on something the living can't see. Those eyes were veiled by a curious film. My heart was pumping so hard that I felt actual physical pain. I refused to believe what I could guess without difficulty. "Ernst!" I shouted. From the back of the truck, my shout was answered by several others. I pushed my companion down on the seat, imploring heaven to let him live. But his body fell heavily against the other side of the cabin. Death! He was dead! "Ernst! Mama! Help me!" In a delirium of terror, I leaned against the truck door and then let myself drop, trembling, onto the running board. I tried to persuade myself that none of this was happening, that it was all a nightmare from which I would wake to see another horizon. As I sat and thought, I still had no idea of the extent of irremediable evil. I dreamed of what life would be like when I shook off this horrible nightmare in which my friend had just died, but my eyes could see only mud sucking at my boots. 2 heads looked out from the back of the truck. They were saying something, but I didn't hear them. I stood up and, turning my back on them, walked off a short distance. That small physical effort reawakened some sense of life and hope, and I tried to tell myself that all of this wasn't really serious, that it was only a bad dream I had to forget. I tried to impose an expression of smiling derision on my features. 2 of the wounded men jumped down from the truck to relieve themselves. I stared at them unseeing, while the vitality of being alive beat back the darkness. I began to think with hope that surely all the German soldiers in Russia would be sent to help us, that something must be coming to help us. Suddenly I thought of the French. They were already on their way. All our newspapers said so. The first legionnaires had already set out. I had seen the photographs. I felt a hot flush run through me. Ernst would be avenged, that poor fool who had never hurt a fly, who had spent his time making life more endurable for wretched soldiers shaking with cold. And his marvellous hot showers. The French would come, and I would run to embrace them. Ernst had loved them like his own compatriots. This surge of hope and joy could not be dampened by facts I didn't know, like the fact that the French had decided on quite another course. "What's happened?" asked one of the men, whose grey bandage was falling over his eyes. Are we out of gas? No, my friend has just been killed. They looked into the cabin. Fuck, that's not so bad. At least he didn't have to suffer. I knew that Ernst's agony had lasted for nearly half an hour. We ought to bury him, one of them said. The three of us lifted out the body, which was already stiffening. I moved like an automaton, and my face was without expression. I saw a small rise of ground, which was less trampled than everywhere else, and we took Ernst there. We had no shovels, so we dug the grave with our helmets, rifle butts, and bare hands. I myself collected Ernst's identity tags and papers. The other two were already pushing back the dirt and trampling it down with their boots when I looked my last on that mutilated face. I felt that something had hardened in my spirit forever. Nothing could be worse than this. We pushed in a stick at the head of the grave and hung Ernst's helmet on it. I slit the stick with the point of my bayonet and slid in a piece of paper torn from the notebook Ernst always carried with him, inscribed naively in French, Ici j'ai enterré mon ami, Ernst Neubach. Then, to forestall another emotional crisis, I turned and ran back to the truck. We started off again. One of the wounded had come to the front and taken Ernst's place, a stupid-looking man who fell asleep almost at once. 10 minutes later, the motor coughed and then died. The jolt woke my sleeping companion. Something wrong with the engine? No, I said in an offhand voice. We're out of gas. Shit! So what'll we do? We'll walk. On this nice sunny day, it should be grand. The strongest will have to help the others. My friend's death had abruptly turned me into a cynic, and I felt almost glad that the others would have to suffer with me. My companion looked me up and down. You don't mean that. We can't walk. We're all burning up with fever. His stupid assurance made me furious. He was clearly a half-wit who never questioned anything and had gone to war because he'd been sent. Then a Russian shell had gone off too close, and he'd been pierced, and that is all he felt or knew. Since then he'd been dozing and stuffing himself with sulfanilamide. Well, you can stay here and wait for help, or for Ivan. I'm clearing out. I ran to the back door, kicked it open, and explained the situation. Inside it stank. The men were lying in a revolting mess. Some of them didn't even hear me, and I felt ashamed and brutal. But what else was there to do? 7 or 8 haggard men pulled themselves up. Their faces were amazingly drawn. They looked at each other in terror, like trapped rats. I thought of Ernst's white marble face and burst out, I'm off! You can come or stay! Do what you like! They gazed at me in bewilderment, and I jumped down and began to run in a direction that would almost certainly kill me. But at that moment I would have preferred death. In fact, 4 or 5 of the men jumped down after me. We passed the wreck of a Russian tank and a few dead horses. This morning was no good. Boom, boom, pretty close. We went out of the shed. On the roof of the little building in front of us, some Russians from the kolkhoz were inspecting the horizon. We heard some more long-drawn-out explosions. Bolsheviks are very close, said one of the Ukrainians, turning to us. We'll leave with Kamerad Soldat German. Where are the wounded? My companion asked, irritated at having been caught off balance. Where did you put it yesterday? Answered Popov. 2 German dead. We looked at him in confusion. Come and help us, my companion said. 2 of the more seriously wounded men had died. There were now 4, all in poor condition. One of them was groaning and holding his right arm, whose hand was missing. His purulent dressing glistened with the gangrene that was already devouring him. Dig 2 graves over there, ordered the tall soldier. We must bury these men. We are not soldiers, answered Popov, still smiling. You dig grave, 2 graves, insisted the German, aiming his gun at the Russians. 2 graves, and quick. The Russian's eye gleamed wildly as he stared at the black hollow of the gun barrel. He said a few words in Russian, and the others busied themselves with the job. We had begun to change the dressings of the wounded when we heard the sound of a motor in the courtyard. Without thinking, we ran out. Several armoured vehicles had just driven in, and a gang of German soldiers was running toward the big drinking trough. They were followed by 4 or 5 Mark IV-S. An officer climbed from a Steiner, and we ran to meet him, telling him who we were. "Alles gut," said the officer. "Help us load up and leave with us." We tried to get the amphibious VW to start, but that proved impossible. We dragged it from the hut, and one of the Lancer threw a grenade into the engine. A moment later, it blew to pieces. More vehicles arrived. Others left in the direction from which we'd come. We couldn't understand what was happening. The sound of explosions from the southeast was continuous. The road that ran through the kolkhoz was a stream of traffic of every description. Whenever anyone stopped, I asked for news of my unit, but no one knew anything. It seemed likely that my companions of the 19th Rollbahn were far to the west by now, far from the front to which it seemed I was being sent. A little while later, I turned west again, in the company of soldiers drawn from many infantry units. The fact that I was involved with this group caused me considerable difficulty a few days later. We appeared to be taking a line parallel to the front, at right angles to the Russian thrust. Far to the north, the Russians were pushing toward the south, hoping to surround the German forces still in the Voronezh-Kursk-Kharkov triangle. For a day and a half we followed a muddy rut, on which our only troubles were mechanical. The machines we were using had been in Russia since the German advance of 1941 and had been pushed hard. Our forces were obliged to abandon large numbers of trucks, tractors and tanks. The tanks in particular had taken a beating, often having been used for work their designers had never imagined. They were almost the only vehicles able to move normally during the winter months, and a tank pulling 5 trucks along a snowy mule track was not an unusual sight. When they had to face the Russian counter-offensive, this rough usage, coupled with their lightness, which had served us so well until then, made them no match for the famous T-34S, incontestably superior to the Mark II-S and -3S. Later, our Tigers and Panthers stood up to Soviet armour and played with their T-34S and KW-85S. Unfortunately, as in the air, our inadequate numbers had to yield to an enemy multitude fighting on 2 fronts. We were obliged, in effect, to defend a fortress with a circumference of 2,000 miles. To cite a single example, the fighting on the Vistula, north of Krakow, pitted 28,000 Germans, supported by 36 Tiger tanks, and 20 Panthers against 2 strong Soviet armies of 600,000 men and 7 armoured regiments, disposing of 1,100 tanks of various kinds. Toward noon the next day, we arrived at a small village about 15 miles northeast of Kharkov, with a name like Ucheni. I can no longer remember precisely. The place was filled with smoke, and to judge by the noise, fighting was still going on quite nearby. The Steiner of the officer who had picked us up at the kolkhoz drew ahead, while the rest of us jumped down from our machines. Flickering light a mile or so to the south marked the line of fire. The soldiers who had come with me peed into a hedge or chewed some food, with blank faces. I myself have never been able to achieve a resigned, indifferent attitude in the face of pressing danger. Nevertheless, I tried to hide my desperate anxiety. Perhaps the others were doing the same thing. The Steiner came back, and 2 non-coms wrote down our names. Then we were organised into groups of 15, led either by a sergeant or an Obergefreiter, senior lance corporal or acting corporal. The officer climbed onto the seat of the Steiner and spoke to us briefly, mincing no words. "The enemy has cut us off from our line of retreat. To get around them we would have to turn north onto the plain, where there are no roads. This could be fatal. Therefore we will have to break through their barrage to reach our new positions, which are quite close. As further elements of the Don Army arrive, they will be used to maintain the passage already opened, which will allow all our soldiers to escape the Bolshevik noose. Thereafter you will proceed to positions which will be announced and which you will maintain until further orders. Good luck! Heil Hitler!" I was about to say that I belonged to the transport service when I suddenly felt ashamed. Munitions boxes were opened and their contents distributed. My pockets and cartridge pouches were full, and I was given 2 defensive grenades, which I didn't know how to operate. We moved single file to the edge of the village, past houses burning from enemy incendiaries. Groups of men were walking about in the debris. Others were tending to the wounded. Some burnt-out German vehicles were still smoking. We were taken over by a lieutenant who asked 5 or 6 of us to follow him down a long street that was still more or less intact. A salvo whistled past us, and we threw ourselves to the ground. It fell somewhere in the centre of the village, about 700 or 800 yards behind us. Enemy shells had dug several holes in the packed earth, which lay between 2 rows of buildings, and occasional mutilated bodies lay sprawled on the street. We walked for about 15 minutes, sticking close to the buildings, until we heard the sound of automatic weapons. About 100 yards ahead of us, the street was swept by mortar fire. We hesitated for a moment. Then we saw some running figures emerging from the wall of dust stirred up by the enemy salvo. "Achtung!" shouted the lieutenant. Instantly, we dropped to our knees, or even onto our stomachs, ready to open fire, but stood up again when we saw German uniforms. The other soldiers ran over to us and threw themselves down by our sides. We could see that still more were coming through the flying dust. Several of them were howling at the tops of their lungs, a sound that combined fear, anger, and pain. I watched a soldier without a gun, who was trying to run while holding his right thigh with both hands. He fell, stood up, and fell again. 2 others were staggering slowly after him. I heard someone shout, "À moi!" and was trying to see which of them had used my language when a fresh salvo struck the group, scattering about 10 of them in search of shelter. 2 of the men continued toward us, despite the danger. They ran to a door, which they were able to kick in without much trouble, and stood in its opening, shouting curses in French. Amazed, and without a thought of danger, I ran across the street, bursting in on them like a whirlwind. They paid no attention to me. "Hey," I said, shaking one of them by his straps. "Are you French?" They turned toward me and looked at me for a fraction of a second. Then their eyes returned to a cloud of dust and smoke pouring from a house that had just burst into flames. "No, the Walloon Division," one of them said, without looking back a second time. A series of explosions made us blink and hunch our shoulders. "Those shits shoot us just like rabbits. They never take prisoners, the bastards." "I'm French," I said with an uncertain smile. "Well then, look out. Volunteers are never prisoners." "But I'm not a volunteer." The street was raked by a new salvo of mortar fire, somewhat closer than before. 20 yards away, a roof disintegrated, and the retreat whistle broke off our conversation. We ran as hard as we could back the way we had just come, followed by a burst of machine gun fire. 2 or 3 men spun round and doubled up, screaming with pain. We almost ran over 2 men with a heavy machine gun, which they hadn't been able to fire because we'd been in the way. Several groups of men had reached a street at right angles to ours and had scattered among the ruins. The lieutenant was blowing his whistle again to regroup us, when 2 Mark 3s suddenly came into sight. They rolled up to the lieutenant, who stood in the middle of the street waving them forward. After a brief consultation, they moved obliquely into the street we had just left, advancing toward the Bolsheviks. The lieutenant tried to reorganize us again, and we set off in the wake of the tanks, which made an infernal din in the rubble-filled streets. I jumped from the corners of buildings to piles of rubble, in a state of terror, unable to grasp why I was there, or to distinguish anything to fire at. For seconds at a time, our tanks would disappear from view in the turmoil of dust, smoke and flames, but they always re-emerged, with their guns firing. Soon we had run past the point where our retreat had begun, into an open space surrounded by wooden peasant houses grouped around a pond. The tanks were driving around the pond, crushing every obstacle. On the far side of the pond, we could easily see men running in several directions. We stood on the bank and opened a concentrated fire. Another German company arrived on our right and threw grenades at a house where some of the enemy had taken shelter. Our tanks were now on the other side of the pond, flattening the position just taken from the enemy. At last I had the opportunity to fire at some Russians. They were no more than 30 yards away, running from the house our soldiers had attacked with grenades. At least 10 Mausers fired, and not one of the Russians stood up again. The fact that we were advancing and that we suddenly felt in control of the situation stimulated us despite everything. We had just dislodged an enemy numerically stronger than us, as was always the case in Russia, and we felt as if we'd been given wings. The sound of firing and the groans of the wounded incited us to massacre the Russians, who had inflicted so many horrifying wounds on us. An attacking army is always more enthusiastic than one on the defensive, and more likely to accomplish prodigies. This was particularly true of the German army, which was organized to attack, and whose defense consisted of slowing the enemy by counterattack. A few of our men took over a Russian cannon and immediately put it into action. A rapid liaison was established between our two tanks and this newly improvised artillery, which poured all the shells just captured from the Russians onto precisely selected targets. Then the tanks turned back, leaving the defense of the area to us. Directed by the lieutenant, we placed ourselves as best we could, in readiness for any new surprises. We could hear continuous firing all around us. A fine rain began to fall. At dusk, we were still exchanging fire with the enemy, who had grown bolder and were trying to come back. With darkness, our terror returned, and the firing almost stopped. The lieutenant sent someone to fetch some flares. To the southwest, the horizon lit up in time with sporadic heavy artillery fire. Without knowing it, we had become part of the Third Battle of Kharkov, whose front extended some 200 miles around the city. With darkness and rain, the fighting for our group was almost over. Behind us, we could still hear the sound of automatics, penetrating the noise of engines. Our vehicles were using the darkness to try to get through the Russian barrage. We thought we might see the Popovs running toward us through the night at any moment. A Volkswagen came up from behind, its lights out. The driver spoke for a moment with the leader of our group and then handed some flat mines to 4 of our men. With white faces, they went off into the darkness to place the mines on either side of the pond. 5 minutes later, we heard a rough cry from the left, and a short time after that, 2 of the 4 came back from the right. After another half hour, we concluded that the 2 who had gone to the left had run into a Russian knife. Much later that night, when we were all feeling overwhelmed by sleep, we witnessed a tragedy that froze my blood. We had just thrown about a dozen grenades at random to forestall some suspected danger, when a prolonged and penetrating cry rose from the hole on my left. It lasted for several minutes, as if coming from the throat of someone fighting desperately. Then there was a cry for help, which brought us all from our holes and shelters. About 10 of us ran toward the sound. The darkness was torn by the white lights of several shots. Fortunately, no one was hit. We arrived at the edge of a foxhole, where a Russian who had just thrown down his revolver was holding his hands in the air. At the bottom of the hole, 2 men were fighting. One of them, a Russian, was waving a large cutlass, holding a man from our group pinned beneath him. 2 of us covered the Russian who had raised his hands, while a young Obergefreiter jumped into the hole and struck the other Russian on the back of his neck with a trenching tool. The Russian let go at once, and the German who had been under him, who had just missed having his throat cut, ran up to ground level. He was covered with blood, brandishing the Russian knife with one hand like a madman, while with the other he tried to stop the flow of blood from his wound. "Where is he?" he shouted furiously. "Where's the other one?" In a few bounding steps, he reached the 2 men and their prisoner. Before anyone could do anything, he had run his knife into the belly of the petrified Russian. "Cutthroat!" he yelled, looking wildly for another belly to open. We had to hold him back so he wouldn't run past our lines. "Let me go!" he shrieked. "I want to show these savages how to use a knife." "Shut up!" shouted the lieutenant, exasperated by having to deal with such a motley crew. "Get back into your foxholes before Ivan machine guns the lot of you." The lunatic, losing a lot of blood, was dragged to the rear by 2 men. I went back to the hole I was sharing with 4 others. I would gladly have fallen asleep, but nervous exhaustion kept me awake. I had not yet absorbed all the emotions of the day and was suffering a belated reaction. The intermittent rain began to soak into our clothes and weigh them down. The pond gave off a faint smell. 2 men began to snore. Throughout the night, which seemed interminable, I kept up a dull conversation with my companions to prevent a nervous collapse. In the distance we could hear the continuous rumble of our retreating trucks. Enemy action began again well before dawn. Flares above our position blinded us with their unexpected white lights. We looked at each other in wordless confusion. The intensity of this diabolic light threw a sinister, almost indecent glare on our ghostly faces. At daybreak, enemy artillery poured a hail of projectiles of every calibre onto the road about a quarter of a mile behind us. Beyond my hole, when I dared look outside, I could see other helmets poking up from below the ground. Under their visors, eyes gleaming with fatigue were trying to discern our immediate future on the dim bank across the pond. I scraped up some crumbs of vitamin biscuit, the last food in my possession. Insomnia and exhaustion made us incapable of grasping the situation with any precision. We were simply there, shivering and wet, and if even a small group of Russians had appeared, we wouldn't have been able to stop them. Fortunately, the Soviets didn't attack, and we were only subjected to one round of mortar fire, which nevertheless wounded 9 of us. At last, the sun rose, and we felt somewhat better. When it reached its zenith, we were still waiting in our holes, which the spring warmth had not been able to dry out. We had not been given any more food, but then a soldier of the Reich was supposed to withstand cold, heat, rain, suffering, hunger, and fear. Our stomachs growled, and the blood beat in our temples and at our smallest joints. But the air and the earth and the universe were growling too. From habit, we were almost able to persuade ourselves that this was a possible way to live. I know of many who actually managed it. Toward 6 o'clock that evening, we were ordered to abandon our positions. This step required many precautions. We had to cover a considerable distance with all our equipment, while 2 men stayed behind to lay mines for the enemy. When we reached the ruins of the first house, we were finally able to straighten up. We went into the battered buildings whenever we could to look for food. I can remember devouring 3 raw potatoes and finding them delicious. We arrived at the crossroads from which our group had set out 24 hours earlier. The 2 mutilated but recognizable roads we had taken the day before had been turned into a jumble of churned earth. As far as I could see, the disabled carcasses of Wehrmacht vehicles lay scattered in a haze of whirling smoke across the ruins of what must once have been houses. There were several muddy German bodies lying in rigid attitudes beside wrecked machines, waiting for the burial squad. Some men from the engineers were setting fire to the vehicles that blocked the road. We walked through this chaos for a while, supporting our wounded. 100 yards away, another group, larger than ours, was also withdrawing, with arms and equipment. We followed the lieutenant as far as the regroupment centre, abandoned by the officers 2 hours before we received the order to withdraw. Not a soul was left in the battered building, which had housed the officers responsible for the defence of the town. A sergeant on a motorcycle was waiting alone in front of the building to instruct stragglers. The lieutenant seemed disgusted by the available options and continued to lead us westward. We covered another 12 miles on foot, constantly threatened by Soviet patrols, who would open fire without hesitation on even a single famished lancer. After diving down some 30 times or more to avoid Russian salvos, we arrived at a Luftwaffe airfield, which had already been abandoned. We thought that the wooden buildings, which were like the ones we had occupied on the Don, might still contain some scraps of food. Carrying our 4 wounded men on improvised stretchers, we walked toward one of the huts, stumbling with exhaustion. But we never reached it. A scene of intense horror stopped 6 or 7 of us. We had just passed a bunker where we noticed a body lying at the bottom. 2 emaciated cats were eating one of its hands. I felt sick. "Get out, you damned cats!" shouted my companion. Everyone came over to look. The lieutenant, as sickened as I had been, threw a grenade. The 2 ghostly cats ran off into the countryside, while the explosion sent a column of more or less human debris straight up into the air, like a chimney. "If the cats are eating stiffs," somebody said, "there couldn't be much left in the pantry." There were still 2 bimotors with Maltese crosses on their wings standing on the empty field, probably inoperable in some way. From the sky, we heard a disquieting sound, which was growing louder. We all turned our white faces the same way, suddenly realizing that we were standing beside two planes in the center of a vast, flat space, and could hardly fail to attract attention. We scattered without waiting for any orders, flinging ourselves onto the ground, trying to escape those 6 black dots, which were already falling toward us like lightning. I thought immediately of the bunker where the cats had been feasting. 6 others had the same idea, and although I ran as fast as I could, I arrived next to last beside the hole where 4 soldiers were already trampling on what was left of a human being. I looked desperately into that crowded space, hoping that some miracle would make it larger. 2 others were doing the same thing. Maybe we'd made a mistake. Maybe the planes were really ours. But that was impossible. The sound was unmistakable. The noise grew louder and louder. We threw ourselves down, painfully aware of our absolute exposure. I held my head between my hands and closed my eyes, trying to obliterate the muffled explosions reaching my partially blocked ears. I felt the fury of hell pass over me like a hurricane. The blows striking the earth shook every organ in my body, and I knew that I was going to die. Then the storm passed as quickly as it had come. I lifted my head to see the enemy formation break apart as it climbed higher into the pale blue sky. Here and there, across the field, men were getting up and running for better cover. The Russian planes had regrouped and were turning as tightly as they could. Then they swooped down at us again. I felt a bitter presentiment freeze my blood. I began to run like a madman, with my legs flying, trying to force myself to go faster. But I knew that exhaustion had the upper hand, that I would never reach the road with its ditch, which might shelter me. I kept stumbling over my heavy boots. In desperation, and despite myself, I fell onto the wet grass, instinctively aware that the planes were on top of us again. The first explosions shook the ground, filling me with frantic fear. I scratched at the ground like a rabbit whose last hope of escape is to bury itself. I could hear the earth being torn and horrifying human shrieks. White flashes burned into my eyes through my clenched fists and eyelids. I lay there for what seemed like an eternity. When I finally looked up, the 2 bimotors were burning like torches. The Russian planes were far off, turning back into formation for another attack. They had pulled up after this one in all directions. Once again, I called on all my reserves of strength to get up and run, this time towards the wooden buildings, which suddenly seemed to offer refuge. I had covered about a third of the distance when the Russian planes attacked again, shooting rockets into the buildings, which disintegrated like matchwood. After a few moments of further terror, we could hear the engines of the planes fading into the distance. Everyone who was able stood up again. No one spoke. We stared at the flames, at the sky, at the reddening heaps of human remains. Our lieutenant, who seemed to have lost his sanity despite being unhurt, was running from one wounded man to another. "Shit!" someone shouted. "Another attack like that, and there won't be anyone left. They've just left us here. We'll never get out." "Shut up!" shouted the lieutenant, who was supporting a wounded man. "War is never a picnic." Who did he think he was telling? We gathered around him. He lifted the shoulders of a poor fellow covered with mud and blood, who was laughing uncontrollably. For a moment, I thought he was crying with pain, but he was actually howling with laughter. "Das ist der Philosoph," someone said. I had never noticed the man before. His friend added that he had always believed he would return home unscathed. 3 of us tried to lift him to his feet, but soon realized it was impossible. His bursts of laughter were interrupted by words which I understood perfectly, and thought about for a long time afterward, and which still trouble me. As I remember his laugh, there was nothing mad about it. It was more like the laugh of someone who has been the victim of a practical joke, a farce in which he had believed until he suddenly realized his folly. No one questioned the philosopher, but he himself, through his hilarity and agony, tried to explain, "Now I know why. I know why. It's too simple. It's idiotic." Perhaps we would have learned what he meant, but a sudden surge of blood poured from his mouth and ended his life. We dug graves for the new victims and then stretched out, exhausted, on the bed of warm ashes that marked the site of the destroyed buildings. At nightfall, we were wakened by the sound of guns, which seemed to be following us. By now, we all felt desperately hungry and thirsty. Despite our rest, we had not recovered our strength, and we looked appalling. We stared at each other suspiciously, wondering if the next fellow had a couple of biscuits hidden somewhere, forgetting the lessons of comradeship we had been taught in Poland. But apparently we were all cleaned out. If anyone had been hiding something, we could scarcely have reproached him, as we all might easily have done the same thing. In the darkness, as we fled the curtain of flares which had pursued us since our retreat from the Don, we heard once again the sound of a moving column and were once again filled with panic. The night was as black as pitch. A fine rain was falling. We followed the lieutenant. God knows where he was taking us. No one spoke. Our strength seemed barely adequate to move our legs, weighted by exhaustion and mud. Finally, the lieutenant spoke. "Maybe they'll go by without seeing us. Are any of you anti-tank gunners?" Quickly, our solitary Spandau was set up for a final effort of defence. Luckily, the exhaustion which made my temples throb under my leaden helmet prevented me from clearly grasping the seriousness of our situation. The simple fact that we had stopped walking presented my foundering body with a moment of relief that had to be used to the utmost. I knew that my fear would return with my breath, and that I would again be aware of everything that was happening. The first black mass which came into view, with all its lights out, seemed to be some kind of light vehicle. We tried to see what it was, but the darkness was too thick. Then we heard tank treads, unmistakable and frightening, as those who have heard the sound on the front at night will appreciate. As the noise grew louder, our panic increased. While some were trying to see where the tanks would come from, others, including myself, lay with their faces pressed into the ground. Two black shapes loomed against the sky some 30 meters away. Another, less than 10 meters from us, made the earth shake and every hair stand on end. Someone called out, "Die Malterkreuzer, mein Gott! Kameraden, Hilfe, Hilfe!" For me, who spoke German so badly and understood it even worse, this was a signal for everyone to save his skin. I jumped up and started to run. This, evidently, is what one should not do. Through the noise of the tanks, I could hear shouts and curses. The group had taken my action as a signal for general flight. Everyone had jumped up and was running, shouting at the tanks, except for the lieutenant and one or two more reflective, prudent soldiers. Later, it occurred to me that even German tanks might have machine-gunned us, taking us for Russians. Also, they might have been Russian tanks. However, we managed to make ourselves recognized and were taken in by a detachment of the 25th Panzer Division, commanded by General Guderian. These men were extremely well equipped and had not been involved in our retreat. They put us wherever there was room, on the backs of the tanks, where the heat of the engine burned our buttocks. No one asked if we'd eaten, and it wasn't until hours later, under the rolling fire of the Russian artillery which was raking Kharkov, that we were served a hot, greasy soup, which we received like a benediction. It was here that I first saw one of the enormous Tiger tanks and 2 or 3 Panthers. I also saw, a few hours later, the appalling avalanche of the famous Katyushas, which poured hours of devastating fire on the German infantry, advancing with appalling losses through the outlying district of Slavyansk-Kiniskov. Guderian's tanks took us right into Kharkov, where the Donetsk battles had already been in progress for more than a week. Once again the Wehrmacht took the battered city, before losing it finally in September, after the failure of the Belgorod counter-offensive. Dawn found us in the sandpits to the northwest of the city, where our group was gone over with a fine-toothed comb by the commandos responsible for sending men back to their original units. As they didn't know where most of these units were, the best they could do was to form the strays into new groups, which everyone wished to avoid. These new units, with no official affiliation or assignments, simply sapped the actual strength of the army as recorded by military registration and on the maps at headquarters. The men assigned to these varied and unmeasurable groups could not be fitted into any logical organization. Already classified as missing or dead by their original units, they were officially considered dead and used as unexpected reinforcements whom there was no reason to spare. Long lines of soldiers, sitting, lying down, asleep and awake, were waiting for orders which would somehow fit them into the battle. I can still remember the look of the Donets Valley and the river, with its wide sandbanks stretching some 8 or 10 miles back from the water. The thunder of guns reached us from the front, which was about 20 miles to the south. The German attack was moving from the north and west. With their left wing protected by the Donets, the panzer assault was driving into the Russian artillery, which had rapidly crossed the river in an attempt to follow up their counter-offensive. Now these batteries had been driven back to the river and were unable to recross it, as all the bridges were out. In effect, the Russians had just made the same mistake as the Germans at Stalingrad, although not on the same scale. In their haste to drive us out, they had overextended their supply lines and underestimated the forces pitted against them. 100,000 Russians, of whom 50,000 were killed, were caught for over a week in the Slavyansk-Kiniskov pocket. Of course, I didn't know what had happened around Kharkov until months later. For me, the Donets battle, like the battles of the Don and of Alcheny, was a smoking chaos, a wellspring of continuous fear, alarm, rumour, and thousands of explosions. I had just been reassigned and was waiting for further instructions with a handful of other filthy, shaggy men when a policeman handed me a scrap of paper. The police, like the commandos, were authorised to organise strays, and the scrap of paper purported to give us the route we must take to return to our company. It seemed that the 19th Rollbahn was operating in the neighbourhood, and the 3 other fellows also belonged to it. We cleared out as quickly as we could. The fear of being incorporated into an impromptu battalion lent wings to our feet. I have never had a very strong sense of direction, but here in this chaos of mud and ruin, even a migratory bird would have lost the north. Our scrawled note only gave us the principal points to look for, which might have been recognisable to regiments camped on the spot. To us, however, in an entirely new landscape, it was almost impossible to distinguish one point from another. The rare signposts that remained on the battered streets had been twisted in the fighting and had to be disregarded. After 1,000 false leads and 1,000 delays, we finally found our company 2 days later. In the meantime, we had been pressed into service unrolling telephone wire for an SS regiment which was mounting an attack. I still remember a railway embankment which some very young SS soldiers were charging under heavy machine gun fire. We huddled in a drainage pipe which had been uncovered in a bombardment, waiting for the SS to take the area, which they did, with heavy losses. Beyond the 2 cement walls, the flash of mortar fire and red-hot metal fragments streaked through the air. Then the same regiment used us to supply a Haubitz battery, which had been engaged for several days in an artillery duel with the Soviet guns on the east bank of the Donets. We were moving the heavy projectiles from their distant depot when we ran into some men from our company, repairing a collapsed bunker. The first familiar face I saw belonged to Ottensheim. "Hey!" I shouted, running to my friend, followed by the 3 others. "It's us!" Ollensheim stared, as if he'd been struck by lightning. "Another 4!" he shouted. "God must be with us! Laus scratched you off the list long ago. There are still 30 who haven't showed up. We thought you must have been put in one of the scrap units." "Don't mention bad luck," I said. "Where's Halls?" "That fellow has all the luck. Right now he's in Trevor, being taken care of, while we dig up this damn dirt." "Was he wounded?" "A fragment in the neck, absolutely nothing. But he was collected along with the seriously wounded. He said he was unconscious for 2 hours, but he always exaggerates." "And Lenson?" "He's fine. He's changing a tread over there." Laus arrived, and we instinctively saluted. "Glad to see you, boys. Really glad." He shook each of us by the hand, his old soldier's face filled with emotion. Then he took a few steps backward. "Announce yourselves clearly and intelligibly, the way I taught you." We conformed to the prescribed pattern with a good will that came from a deep sense of comradeship. But apart from this encounter, everything looked dark. The sky was filled with lowering clouds which threatened rain, and at the 4 cardinal points, white flashes preceded geysers of damp earth and rubble by fractions of seconds. A short time later, Lenson, who was heavier and stronger than I, lifted me bodily from the ground in his delight at seeing me again. Despite the heavy labour we had to perform, the day was coloured by the joy of this reunion. 2 days later, I managed to get to Trevda, which was some 25 miles from the front. Another fellow gave me his place in the DKW he was supposed to drive, and I was able to visit Hulls. I found him in a swarm of wounded men, singing at the top of his lungs. Spring had arrived at last, and the heavily wounded were cavorting between 2 avenues of wild pear trees. Hulls was unable to curb his delight at seeing me. I was carried in triumph by men who had lost arms, who were powdered with sulfonylamides and smeared with unguents. I was made to finish the remains of all the bottles they had opened, and accordingly was not able to keep the appointment I had made with the fellow who had brought me out. After waiting for a while, he grew bored and left without me. I was taken back much later by a driver attached to my camp. Hals made me promise to visit him again, but I never had the chance. A few days later, the doctor found him fit, and he rejoined us. Hals detested the squalid cellar where we were established, and following his lead, I volunteered for service in the motorized infantry. We were fed up with digging and acting as maidservants to the rest of the army. This decision almost cost us our lives many times, but even now, looking back on everything that happened, I cannot regret having belonged to a combat unit. We discovered a sense of comradeship which I have never found again, inexplicable and steady through thick and thin. On a beautiful spring morning, we were assembled at Trevda, where Hals had spent such an enjoyable time. 2 other companies joined us on a hillside covered with short, velvety grass, the kind which thrusts up so thickly that each blade seems to be fighting for space, and which becomes a tall savanna within a month. There were about 900 of us. A group of officers standing on the platform of a half-destroyed truck addressed us from the top of the hill. About 20 flags and regimental pennants had been propped around the base of the truck. The speeches were very courteous. We were even congratulated for our attitude in the past, an attitude which made us feel ashamed whenever we heard any bulletins from the front. We stared at the officers with enormous eyes. They said that because of our attitude, they were prepared to honour any one of us who might wish it by transferring him to a combat unit. About 20 men volunteered at once. The officers, recognising our timidity, tried to put us at our ease and went on talking in the same style. Certain heroic actions were described in detail. 15 more volunteers stepped out of the ranks, among them Lenson, who was clearly born for trouble. Next, the officers mentioned a fortnight's leave, which produced at least 300 volunteers. Then several lieutenants stepped down from the platform. They threaded their way through our ranks, selecting individual men and inviting them to take the 3 fateful steps forward, while a captain maintained the tone of eloquent pressure. The men chosen were always among the largest, healthiest, and strongest. Suddenly, an index finger sheathed in black leather was pointing, like the barrel of a Mauser, into the ribs of my best friend, my war brother. As if hypnotized, Hulls took 3 large steps, and the sound of his heels as he snapped them together was like a door slamming shut, a door which threatened to separate me, perhaps forever, from the only real friend I had ever made, and from the friendship which was my only incentive for life in the midst of despair. After a moment's hesitation, I joined the group of volunteers without any further pressure. I looked confusedly at Hulls, whose face was glowing like the face of a child who has just been given a delightful surprise and who doesn't know what to say. Henceforth, my identification would be Gefreiter Sire, G, 100 1010th G4. 17. Bataillon, Leichte Großdeutschland Division, Sud G. In the evening, we went back to the squalid shelters we had already occupied. Nothing seemed to have changed. The fact that our names had been added to the infantry recruitment lists was the only difference between the life we had led yesterday as truck drivers and our new life as combat troops. We felt somewhat confused as to the attitude we should adopt, but our non-coms allowed us very little time for meditation. They kept us busy cleaning up and restoring to good condition the weapons which had taken a beating during the last battle, a job which took several days. Everything seemed to have quieted down, although strong Soviet counter-thrusts had started several fires to the northeast at Slaviansk. We were also used for the revolting chore of burying the thousands of men who had died in the battle for Kharkov. We were officially designated burial squad one morning at dawn. The light was so faint it was still almost as dark as the middle of the night. Laus informed us that our new job would take the place of the fortnight's leave we had been promised and were so much looking forward to. As a rule, the Russian prisoners were used to bury the dead, but it seemed they had taken to robbing the bodies, stealing wedding rings and other pieces of jewellery. In fact, I think the poor fellows, many of them wounded but designated fit for work, were probably going over the bodies for something to eat. The rations we gave them were absurd. For example, 1 3-quart mess tin of weak soup for every 4 prisoners every 24 hours. On some days they were given nothing but water. Every prisoner caught robbing a German body was immediately shot. There were no official firing squads for these executions. An officer would simply shoot the offender on the spot or hand him over to a couple of toughs who were regularly given this sort of job. Once, to my horror, I saw one of these thugs tying the hands of 3 prisoners to the bars of a gate. When his victims had been secured, he stuck a grenade into the pocket of one of their coats, pulled the pin, and ran for shelter. The 3 Russians, whose guts were blown out, screamed for mercy until the last moment. Although we had already met birds of every colour, these proceedings revolted us so much that violent arguments broke out between us and these criminals every time. They invariably became furious and abusive, shouting insults at us. They said they had escaped from the camp at Tomvos, where the Russians dumped German prisoners, and they told us how our countrymen were being slaughtered. According to them, the infamous Tomvos camp, 60 miles east of Moscow, was an extermination camp. Rations as ludicrous as those we handed out to Russian prisoners at Kharkov were served once a day to men reporting for labour. Men who did not work received nothing. 1 bowl of millet was provided for every 4 men. There was never enough, even for the prisoners who could work. The daily surplus was simply killed. A favourite method of execution was to hammer an empty cartridge case into the nape of the prisoner's neck. It seemed that the Russians often distracted themselves with this type of sport. I myself can well believe that the Russians were capable of this kind of cruelty, after seeing them at work among the pitiful columns of refugees in East Prussia. But Russian excesses did not in any way excuse us for the excesses by our own side. War always reaches the depths of horror because of idiots who perpetuate terror from generation to generation under the pretext of vengeance. We spent hours digging out a long tunnel which had been turned into an emergency hospital during the fighting. The surgeons had been so overloaded that the wounded had almost certainly been abandoned. A line of rough triple-decker beds extended some hundreds of yards down the corridor, each containing 3 blackened, stiff and mutilated bodies. From time to time, an empty space marked the final flight of a dying man. There was no light in this charnel house, except from the electric torches which some of us had fastened to our tunics. These threw beams of horrifying illumination on the thin, swollen faces of the cadavers, which we had to pull out with hooks. Finally, one delicious spring morning, incongruous in that sad, ruined landscape, a muddy truck drove down the track to the new barracks we had moved into the day before. After a brisk half-turn, it stopped about 10 yards from the first building, where a group of men, including myself, were busy removing a heap of gravel and small stones. The back flap of the truck was kicked open, and a plump little corporal jumped down and clicked his heels. Without saluting or saying a word, he rummaged in his right breast pocket, where all military instructions were supposed to be kept. He pulled out a sheet of paper which had been carefully folded 4 times, and read out a long list of names. As he read, he indicated with a wave of his hand that the men named should step to the right. There were about 100 names on the list, among them Olensheim, Lenson, Hals, and Saja. Feeling somewhat anxious, I joined the group on the right. The corporal told us we had 3 minutes to climb aboard the truck with our weapons and packs. Then he clicked his heels again, saluting this time, and turned his back without another word, striding off as if he were suddenly going for a walk. We ran frantically to collect our things. There was no time for conversation. 3 minutes later, 100 breathless soldiers were packed into the truck, whose bulging sides threatened to collapse. The corporal was also on time. He threw a withering glance at the eccentrically bulging packs some of us were carrying, but said nothing. Then he bent down to look at something under the truck. "No more than 45 on board," he barked. "Departure in 30 seconds." He took another 100 paces. We all groaned silently. No one wanted to get down. Everyone had the best of reasons for staying put. 2 or 3 men were shoved off the back. As I was right in the middle, packed in like a sardine, there was no question of moving. Laus finally took matters in hand. He made half the men on the truck get down. The remainder came to exactly 45. The corporal, who was already climbing into the front seat, told the driver to start. Laus gave us a friendly wave. We had received our final orders from him. His last smile more than made up in our eyes for all the duties he had imposed on us. Beside him, the other half of the group, called out by the corporal, watched with dazed faces as we vanished in a whirl of dust. This half of the group joined us 4 days later, 100 miles behind the front lines, at the rest camp of the famous Großdeutschland Division. A large part of the division, especially the convalescing wounded, occupied the rustic Achtirka camp. The division itself held a mobile sector in the vast Kursk-Belgorod region. Everything at the camp was clean and neatly organized, as in the Boy Scouts, only far more lavishly supplied. Achtirka reminded us of an oasis surrounded by the trackless steppe. We jumped down at the corporal's order and lined up in a double file. A captain, a first lieutenant, and a feldwebel walked toward us. Our plump little corporal snapped to attention. These officers were all dressed with astonishing style. The Hauptmann looked like a figure from a costume party, in a jacket of fine grey-green cloth with the red facings of a combat unit, dark green riding breeches, and gleaming cavalry boots. He waved at us and then said something we couldn't quite hear to the feldwebel, who was every bit his equal in elegance. After a short conversation with the Hauptmann, the Feld walked over to us, clicked his heels, and addressed us in a tone which, at least, was more agreeable than that of the corporal who had come to fetch us. "Welcome to the Großdeutschland Division," he shouted. "With us, you will experience a genuine soldier's life, the only life which brings men close to each other on terms of absolute sincerity. Here, a sense of comradeship exists between each and every one of us, which might be put to the test at any moment. Any black sheep, anyone unsuited for comradeship, does not stay in this division. Everyone must be able to count on everyone else, without any qualification whatever. The slightest error on anyone's part affects the whole section. We want no slackers and no strays. Everyone must be prepared either to obey without question or to give orders. Your officers will think for you. Your duty is to show yourselves worthy of them. You will now get yourselves some new clothes and throw away your stinking rags. Absolute cleanliness is the essential foundation for a decent frame of mind. We do not tolerate any sloppiness of appearance." He took a deep breath and then continued. "When these preliminaries have been accomplished, this group of volunteers will receive their passes for the fortnight's leave which has been promised to them. If there is no counter-order, these passes will become effective in 5 days, when the convoy leaves for Svidrigailov. You may now proceed. Heil Hitler." It was a beautiful day. Everything in the camp seemed to be efficiently organized. According to what we'd just heard, one did not trifle with orders, but that seemed a reasonable change after the universe of shit and horror and suffering and panic we had just come from. And then there were our passes. Hals was jumping with delight, like a young goat. Everyone felt overjoyed. Our plump corporal had one more nasty surprise in store for us, but we were all in such a good humour nothing could ruffle us. He ordered us to wash our filthy clothes before turning them into the supply store, where we would draw new ones. We found ourselves transformed into washerwomen, standing stripped to the skin in front of long troughs. Our underclothes were caked with filth, beyond hope of recovery. I kicked my shorts into the air and tore my undershirt into shreds. My last pair of socks, which I'd been wearing since the beginning of the retreat, were nothing but holes and joined my shorts. Then, stark naked, we walked across the grass to the store to hand in our old clothes, which were soaking wet but neatly folded, and receive new ones. 2 women soldiers nearly choked with laughter when they saw us coming. "Hang on to your boots!" shouted the sergeant, who was not particularly amused by the sight of naked boys. "No new boots here!" We were given a fresh issue of everything from caps to first aid kits. However, certain indispensable items were missing, among these underpants and socks, which in the long run proved to be serious omissions, but our spirits were too high to be disturbed at the time. When we were dressed, we were directed to a wooden army barrack. A notice in large, legible characters was tacked beside the door to remind us of the cleanliness which was officially obligatory. The plump little corporal who had accompanied us from Kharkov waved us inside. We looked curiously around our new room, which was rough but impeccably clean. "Rui, Mensch!" shouted the corporal. We instantly fell silent. "Since there isn't a non-com here, I am going to put one of you in charge." He worked his way through our ranks, with his eyes half closed, as if he wished to surprise his choice, who, of course, would not want the responsibility, or as if the decision were somehow significant. Finally, with a sharp cry, he selected a fellow who didn't seem to have anything special about him. "Du." The man he pointed to stepped forward. "Your name?" "Wiedenbeck." "Wiedenbeck, until further notice, you will be responsible for the order of this room. You will go to the Warenlager to pick up the divisional patches, which everyone must sew on his left sleeve. You will also—" He enumerated a list of duties, each of which made poor Wiedenbeck's head droop a little lower. A few minutes later, we each received the famous insignia of the Grossdeutschland Division, with its divisional title in silver Gothic letters on a black ground. This band remained on my sleeve until 1945, when the rumour ran through our scattered ranks that the Americans were shooting any man wearing a divisional name instead of a number. And at that moment of hasty judgment, they might very well have shot a nobody from the Grossdeutschland or the Brandenburg as easily as a hero from the Leibstandarte or the Totenkopf. But that time was still far in the future. We were then in the spring of 1943, on the territory of a conquered country. The weather was marvellous, and as a finishing touch, we all had 2 week passes in our pockets. After everything we had been through, this new life seemed like a dream. Except for morning and evening roll call, we were free to wander about and entertain ourselves as we pleased. Aktyrka was a curious place. Between the houses or groups of houses, which were built in an agreeable Russian peasant style, the grasses and wild flowers of the steppe grew with vigorous abundance, making a kind of thick lawn, which was often nearly 3 feet high. These plants and grasses, which all turned brown at the end of summer, were scattered with enormous daisies and a variety of aromatic plants, which the Russians collected for seasoning their food and preparing drinks. Fields of rough, light green gherkins were set off by enormous sunflowers. The groups of houses were inhabited either by members of a family or by friends, who built in clusters to reduce the effort of paying visits. The Russians, especially the Ukrainians, are very gay and hospitable, and ready to celebrate almost any occasion. I remember several pleasant gatherings at the homes of these enthusiastic people, during which everyone managed to forget the rivalries of the war. I remember the girls shouting with laughter when they had every reason to hate us, on another human scale altogether from the affected Parisian beauty, obsessed by her appearance and her cosmetics. Each group of houses also had its own burial ground, which was never a sad place, but always a beautiful, flowery plot, with wooden tables where people often sat and drank, and an ornamental signpost with an affectionate variation of the place name. Beautiful Aktyrka, our town, Aktyrka, sweet Aktyrka. 4 days after our arrival, the second section of our group of volunteers joined us. It seemed they really had to sweat to make it. Almost the whole journey had been on foot. At last, on the 5th day, we took our places in the convoy for Nedrigailov. Our passes would not become operative until we reached Poznan, which was another 1,000 miles to the west. After that, there would be 600 miles to my parents at Wissembourg. I would therefore be travelling for several days. We drove across a huge expanse of country which was absolutely flat, without the slightest trace of hillock or hollow. Here and there we could see military tractors being used for agricultural work. We were able to maintain a decent speed as far as Nedrigайлов, on a road which had been rebuilt by the army engineers, and which, every 3 or 4 miles, was littered with the wreckage of hastily abandoned Soviet materiel. We had driven for about 150 miles, when our attention was attracted by some tiny shapes outlined against the distant sky. Their black silhouettes were marked by little white clouds and the sound of explosions. The 2 trucks ahead of us slowed down and then stopped. As usual, the Feld responsible for the convoy jumped down from the first truck and stared through his field glasses. As usual, we waited for an order before plunging to the ground. Everyone was quiet, watching the Feld attentively, trying to fathom his reactions. Only the sound of the idling engine broke the stillness. The joy which had transformed our faces these last few days slowly faded as our anxiety grew. A few voices cursed our bad luck. I thought that by now we were good and far from any trouble. "God damn it!" "What do you think it could be?" "Partisans," muttered Howells, who had already taken part in a manhunt. There were several other conjectures as well. "Whoever they are, I'm not going to let the bastards wreck my leave." "I wonder what we're waiting for. Why don't they just tell us to go ahead and shoot them?" Each of us had already picked up the Mauser, which soldiers on leave in an occupied country were required to carry at all times. The idea that somebody or something might prevent us from going home made us feel savage. We were ready to shoot anyone at a moment's notice if that's what was needed to keep moving west. But the order to fire never came. The Feld climbed back onto his truck, and the convoy started off again. We stared at each other in confusion. When, some 500 yards further on, we ran into a group of 20 German officers carrying shotguns, we felt so surprised and delighted that our assumption had been mistaken that we cheered them as if we were driving past the Führer himself. At last we reached Nedrigайлов, where we left the convoy, which turned south. We went on to Romny, the gypsy paradise, where we were supposed to be picked up by another convoy moving west. At Nedrigайлов, our ranks were swelled by other men on leave from various parts of Russia, until there were nearly 1,000 of us. However, the supply of available trucks had to be used for many purposes other than simply transporting men on leave. The few trucks for Romny took on about 20 fortunate souls. The rest of us were left to mill about in front of a field kitchen, equipped to feed barely a quarter of our number. Although we were famished, we decided to walk the 30 miles to Romny and set off despite the lateness of the hour, in the best of spirits. About 20 fellows who were considerably older than the rest of us and belonged to the Grossdeutschland division came along. There were also 7 or 8 fellows from the SS who sang at the tops of their lungs. The others took swigs from bottles which they passed from hand to hand. They must have emptied several cellars. Every one of them seemed to be carrying a generous collection. We had instinctively arranged ourselves in threes, as if we were going up to the line and were proceeding on the double, consciously reducing the distance which separated us from Romny. Evening was slowly falling across the endless green rolling landscape. Our uniforms, so perfectly matched to outdoor colours, seemed to take on the tone of the surrounding landscape, like chameleon skins. After the first 10 miles, our high spirits faded somewhat, leaving us more inclined to contemplate the immense panorama of the Ukraine. The earth, engaged in the processes of spring germination, exhaled a subtle but nonetheless powerful odour as the horizon faded into the boundless emptiness of the darkening sky.